Hey crew, today I want to talk about a case study I did with a post-pregnant lady who had disc pain that had been pretty nasty since the birth of her second child. She was now 18 months postpartum, and yeah, she presented with classic disc bulge signs. She was pretty emotional when she was talking about it. She felt like the birth of her child had had a fair bit to do with it. She noticed the onset of the pain a few days after giving birth, which is why we spent a little bit of time going through what actually happened in that space. She had had no back pain prior to this. Her first child had been a natural delivery, second child was a Caesar. And as she started to tell me about the Caesar, she got quite emotional. Um, when we leaned into that, she was able to articulate how angry she felt. She felt like she'd been railroaded into that decision. So there was a lot of anger towards the caregivers in the room, um, that she'd been suppressing because she'd been telling herself, but that's what was required to get my baby out. And that somehow she wasn't allowed to feel that anger. She'd convinced herself she wasn't allowed to feel it because her logical mind had rationalized that that was what was required to get the baby out. And yes, that was true, but it doesn't deny the fact she felt the anger and that we're allowed to have our feelings. We can often see why something's unfolded the way it has, but we're also allowed to have a feeling reaction to it. And those feelings, as part of the Bulletproof backs method and as part of all somatic therapy, are to be moved through our body, not shoved down. And so I parked that. I could see that was a part of her story that we needed to revisit. We also then, I noticed as I was observing her movements that her ability to anteriorly tilt, which is this movement, the ability of her pelvis to be able to roll forward, was extremely limited. She tended to hold her pelvis here in what I would call a posterior tilt. And that when I asked her to explore the full motion, that's about all she had. And she didn't know why she stopped there. She literally just thought that was the limit of the movement. There was no pain. This felt comfortable. This felt like she was at her limit, but not by pain. There was something else that, she didn't realize that was very limited in the scope of normal motion. Now, that made me curious about her cesarean scar because I've seen that pattern and it's logical that when we cut the lower abdominal tissue or we cut the lower abdomen, there's a period of time where we naturally hold ourselves in a posterior tilt to allow the scar to heal. We're told not to lift, not to do anything too heavy so that those tissues can mend. And in fact, if there's stitching in place and you go into a big forward tilt, you'd most likely open that scar. So the body learns to be on the safe side of that movement and to keep itself there because every time it tries to go forward, it gets the sense of tissue stretch and it retreats because it knows this is safety. Now, the problem is that can take sometimes 6 weeks for that scar to heal internally. Within that time, the body has adapted to thinking that that's its limit. Oh, I can't go there because I get a pain response or I get a tissue response. Long after that tissue response is healed, we then have a pelvis that thinks it has a limit. And it's not until it's invited to explore where it used to be able to go that it knows all of that is now available to it. With our discs, if we're walking around in a posterior tilt all day, it's essentially a window encouraging discs to bulge posteriorly. Most of the way we encourage discs, we know sometimes they like more of an extension-based posture because the back of the vertebrae close, encouraging the disc to move forward rather than letting it bulge outwards. Lots of these methods rely on extension, the McGill Big Three, Mackenzie extension exercises. It's a known way to treat certain disc injuries. Now, the problem is this pelvis hasn't been able to anteriorly tilt, which means the lumbar vertebrae haven't been able to experience extension for a long time, 18 months. She's carrying a child, she's got a weak core, yada, yada, yada. There are many factors keeping her in this cycle. She had tried core strengthening, and I would say that her core activations and strength for the range of pelvic motion that she had was actually really quite good. So I wasn't going to add more in that department because that had already been done and it wasn't changing anything. So as a practitioner in my method, I will always go for the emotions first if the person in front of me seems willing to go there. And this beautiful young mum was, and I get quite emotional thinking about it. We simply laid her on her back and I palpated her cesarean scar. As I was palpating, there was almost like a fire that shot, like an electric shock that came from a nodule within the scar tissue itself. I almost pulled my hand away because of the intensity of the feeling. I didn't because at that moment, the patient in front of me started crying, sobbing, which I encouraged her to keep going with. I didn't want to pull my hand away at that moment because I felt intuitively that would have broken something that would needed to remain in contact. So I simply held my finger on that electric hot spot and allowed her to cry. I encouraged her to fully lean into what she was feeling, to not suppress it, to be with it, that it was welcome, that it was natural, that she had every right to feel the anger she felt, and to just to simply stay with the emotion she was feeling, not to judge it, just to lean in and feel it fully, not to try and rush through it, not to intellectualize it, just to feel it. That probably took a few minutes. She sobbed. She, she started speaking about the experience, about she went back to that moment and everything that was going on in the room and why she felt the anger and. And what I felt under my fingers was the charge completely go out of that spot, and it became the tissue became almost I could almost not feel the spot anymore. It was phenomenal as a practitioner to experience. But I've had many of those experiences that make me realize there's so many ways to heal people and bodies, and not all of it requires dry needling and massage and manipulation and all the intense treatment things that people have done to their bodies. Sometimes it's a light touch in the right place and an invitation to experience emotions that is the true healing. What we then noticed after we had somatically experienced what the tissue was holding, and then re-invited the pelvis to move, we explored, well, what's that done? Has that changed anything? And both the client and I were quite pleased to see that now that pelvis moved. It gained almost 50% range that it hadn't had before. It still wasn't full, but it had let go, say 50%. And that range now felt new but safe and comfortable. What the client now experienced is when she went into a full reach, into a full forward tilt, she experienced tension in the scar, which I would say is natural and normal and a really nice place to start with some scar work to even free that pelvis further. which is what we did. Within that session, we simply freed the forward tilt. But to free the forward tilt, we had to release some emotions and we had to do a little bit of scar work. We had to keep reinforcing to the nervous system that this was now a new safe movement, not a new movement, just a return to a movement that used to be in the movement system but had been shut down for a period of time. And with that forward tilt, we then started to experience lumbar extension, which those discs loved. No core stability, emotional release, scar work, reintegration of the pelvis back into the whole of who this woman was. And that was a beautiful session. And that was an example of how the Bulletproof Backs method works for a disc injury. Now, the next person I see with a disc injury, there's a completely different story each time. It's completely different for everyone. So my objective in sharing this is not that every person with a disc pain must have a cesarean scar issue and be holding anger. It's more to help you see the layering, the complexity. But if you take a systemized approach, you can find your way into freedom. And once you're in freedom, get strong. But what I see a lot of people doing is trying to get strong to get their way out of back pain. And to me, that's like the icing that goes on the cake. But we need to look at all the ingredients in the mix to get ourselves to where we want to be. If you like this video series, great, like, subscribe, check out my book if you're a patient or any of my courses, or if you're a practitioner and you really want to develop some holistic frameworks that are science-based to deal with stubborn back pain so that you actually feel like you know what you're doing rather than flying around in the dark and hoping that something you do will make a difference, then go and enroll and I'll help you. This is my passion. This is what I love to do. But what frustrates me is how back pain is currently being managed. I think we can do a hell of a lot better than what we're doing. I think we're focusing exclusively on the physical structure and we are completely forgetting that the body has a mind, has a heart, has feelings, has a soul, and the integration of all of that is what truly helps us figure out where we're resisting and move us towards healing. I hope this has been of some help.